Good evening. I'm Joshua Shaddox. This is History US 530 discussion board post number 3. This week we are talking about the fundamentalist-modernist controversy, and this period is important to examine and to understand as Christians for several reasons. One of them is because you can't protect the future if you don't understand the past. Number two, I might say, is if you don't learn from the past, then you run the risk of repeating similar mistakes in the future. And then number three, we make claims that we agree with stuff or we don't agree with stuff, but we have to understand the why people chose the camps that they were in back then. And unfortunately, not everything is neatly tucked into simply old versus new or modern versus fundamental or even traditional versus liberal. For example, I want to talk to you today about a man named Hiram Wesley Evans. Evans is a fellow from Alabama. He was born in 1881. He went to college to become a dentist, and then he moved to Dallas, Texas, where he opened a practice there. And in 1924, he was featured on the cover of Time magazine, their June issue, and he's just a nice, clean-cut American citizen, according to what you see from that picture. Now, the reason that Hiram Wesley Evans was on the cover of Time magazine is because in 1920 he joined the Ku Klux Klan, and he actually rose to the Imperial Wizard status, which I guess is like their head person, their national leader. And he wrote a book, or he wrote several works. One of them is the highly critiqued the Klan fight, or excuse me, the Klan's fight for Americanism, and that was a controversial piece that was published in 1926. Remember, 1925 was when the Scopes trial happened, right? The Scopes monkey trial. And so the reason I bring him up is because you might be surprised to learn that Evans was a devout Democrat, like many fundamentalist Christians of his day. Do you remember William Jennings Bryan that we talked about, the guy that chose to prosecute the Scopes trial? He was also a Democrat. And J. Frank Norris, the Baptist Democrat preacher that we read about in this week's articles, who was in a Baptist preacher in Fort Worth, Texas. And so it's very interesting that those two would be in the same camp with him. In fact, the Ku Klux Klan supported and praised many fundamental Christian politicians in the 1920s. And one of them was Jennings, that they touted as a champion for their cause, or not their cause specifically, but the cause that they thought. Also, Evans called himself a Protestant, and you might be shocked and surprised that his work uses the word Protestant several times. One of the main principles of this treatise that he put together is that Protestantism must be supreme, and that their fight, the Klan's fight, that is, was to maintain a pure American idea, and it lie in embracing and defending Protestantism against the onslaught of new immigrants who were mostly Catholics and Jews. And so, in this tirade that he put together, he discusses America's founding as a Protestant founding, and he claimed that the forefathers were Protestants by nature, if not religion. And I thought that was an interesting claim from a theological standpoint, but you can understand that in their time period, not even 100 years ago, they understood that the founding of this nation was a Protestant work. I would say that Evans had his claims because he opens his manifesto by claiming that they, in other words, those that were against the changes, had won the leadership in the movement of Americanism against these that were called liberals. And so that's interesting, again, going back to our conversation about tradition versus liberal and fundamental versus modernist. He considered himself in the fundamental camp against the liberal camp. And Evans considered himself a fundamental Christian. He defending America. He was defending America. That's what his claim was. And in fact, in his manifesto here, he wanted the Bible restored to the classroom. And the reason for that was he wrote this, and it is the basis, meaning the Bible is the basis on which all Christian religions are built into which they must look for their authority. And this is absolutely a fundamentalist claim, isn't it? And so the reason I bring this whole thing to light is because um, I think it serves as a warning. We have to be careful, especially as historians and most definitely as Christians, that we evaluate the parts before we answer the whole. We have to understand the integral pieces instead of just the big themes, and we got to dig into it so that we're careful not to cast support into um, a certain cause or a certain idea of history without fervent study and without fervent prayer. And when it comes to historical ideals, especially Christian themes, we must understand the whole picture and not ignore the uncomfortable parts. Most importantly, we must seek to follow the truth and not our opinions or our emotions. So, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing some responses.